Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this wonderful Friday evening. We are here to discuss a very interesting topic, which is deregulation and the role of the state in that. Where we arrived upon this topic was an interesting precipice because the four of us met at a policy workshop in Bangalore near with the outset of the beautiful Nandi Hills, and we were discussing on and submitting a very interesting policy project on the behalf of Takshashila Institution on AI and the role of AI diffusion, wherein with any such innovative technology, when we do discuss regulation and of course deregulation. So what they are, what deregulation is, what its historical foundations, philosophical foundations, and context across the global world looks like was something we wanted to take it forward. And I think that we can start right there. And I'm Udayon. I am based near Delhi. I work in a leadership advisory firm, and I'm very happy to let my other podcastees introduce themselves. Shiniket, do you want to go for it?
Thanks, Uday. And of course, pleasure meeting you all that day and glad that it continued to be a fruitful relationship. And now here we are talking further about policy, which is a good thing, bad thing, depends on how you take it. Either way, I'm Shriniket. I'm originally based in Chennai. I'm a management consultant, although I predominantly work out of the US now. So pleasure to meet you all.
Abhishek?
Hi everyone, this is Abhishek Subramaniam. I am presently based out of Bhubaneswar in Odisha. I work with the Reserve Bank of India, which is the central bank of the country. So I am part of the regulatory architecture of this country. So it will be quite interesting for me to sit down with my friends here and discuss this wonderful topic or quite an insightful topic on deregulation. Let's see where it takes us.
I am Somesh Ba. I come from Pune, and currently I work as a technology analyst in an IT firm, in a cloud computing firm. So yes, very much interested for today's discussion, coming from a corporate lens or having been worked in corporate space. Let's see how can I add to this podcast and to this perspectives. Yeah, so excited for it.
Thanks, Somesh. Interesting area we are in. I think it's very interesting that the four of us are discussing because of the backgrounds we have, because we'll discuss how different regions and how the government, how the Reserve Bank, for instance, and even, Shiniket, you sitting in the US and seeing the attitudes of, global governments when it comes to regulation. There's been a shift of tone recently, with the rise of the so-called right-wing populism. So how do you think that's affected current attitudes towards government regulation? Abhishek, do you want to go for it?
Yeah, Udhayan, definitely. So, as you just mentioned, this entire movement of deregulation or this entire focus on deregulation arises from this, if I can call it that way, the craze for right wing populism that is happening at the present moment. So, when we look at the conceptual foundation of populism, it is based out of an anti establishment movement. So, it is that what is the status quo, populism wants to go against it. So, given that for decades, especially in the post-World War II years, a lot of liberalism had come into the picture. A lot of state regulations, a lot of international organizations, especially under the leadership of United Nations. When this entire architecture has come up, now given that we have reached the pinnacle of this regulatory architecture, there is this pushback through right-wing populism against this excessive regulation, and that is where the fundamental foundation for the current context of deregulation is put. And secondly, yet another thing, given the Trump 2.0 that has taken office in the recent past, so if you just go back a few decades, it was in the year 1981 when President Ronald Reagan he was taking his office for the first time, and his inauguration address he said that government is not the solution to our problems, but government is the problem. So that actually defines right wing populism. That actually defines why there is a push for deregulation. And quite interestingly, when Donald Trump took office January 20th, 2025, one of the first traits to make it into his Oval Office was that of President Ronald Reagan. So that is where I think the entire current context and movement is going at present.
Thanks, Abhishek. Super interesting, actually. I mean, I'm also just thinking more broadly, right? Like, India announced a deregulation commission, designed around primarily making the ease of doing business a little better. But we can come into that. But what are some other examples that we can think of in the global sense? I know that Argentina and Javier Milei have been a very vocal defender of deregulation, free market enterprises, just getting the government out of the way. The government is the problem, as you very succinctly put. Somesh, do you have any thoughts on Argentina and what they've done within this context? Like, are you familiar? What are your thoughts on around these topics?
Sure. I can, if we are talking about the context wherein we take the case of regulation or deregulation and put it across various cases that are found in modern nations, the key feature that is most often discussed would be Argentina. We can come on Argentina in a detailed discussion sometime later in this podcast, or I can share details on that. However, I would also like to highlight some unusual or uncommon novel examples that we might often miss. Now, along with Argentina, one nation that is also pretty much in this talking spheres of deregulation is ironically Vietnam, once a socialist heaven and still a socialist uh, country, commanding leadership country. Vietnam has been in the picture of the global stage for its massive increase in its revenue, in its GDP. Its business share has been going on a steep curve, upward curve, and now they have gone a way ahead and they are quite into deregulation phase. So they have resolved or they have worked to reduce their number of ministries, if I'm right, from 18 to 15. They are bringing in more cuts, or they are making sure that their private sector gets some benefit and gets the ease of doing business, as we are putting it in our Indian construct for especially the sector of energy. So that is a key case that I find useful. Yes, and I guess Abhishek can shed more light on Argentina. Before closing my argument, another unusual example or quite novel example that I would like to highlight here is the case of Pakistan. So, being an authoritative state or a quasi military state, the concept of deregulation in the Pakistani administration might be surprising for all of us. However, uh, at with the start of this decade, Pakistan did have policy efforts or administrative efforts that were directed into deregularizing their energy sector and their petroleum sector. So yeah, these two are also, I mean, cases that I feel are important in this discussion. Abhishek,
Thanks,
would you
Somesh.
like to add? Yeah.
Thanks, Somesh. It's an interesting point. Abhishek, do you want to go for it?
Yeah, just building upon the interesting examples that Somesh was giving, and as you had asked about Argentina and Javier Milei, so yeah, when he came to power on this entire plank of true liberal, true liberalism and deregulation, I think in the later part of 2023. So again, starting with certain symbols, as soon as Trump came to power, and as we all know, Elon Musk actually wields a lot of influence on Trump presidency at present. So there was American Political Action Forum, Conservative Forum meeting that happened in the US, and Javier Milei interestingly made an appearance in that Conservative Forum. And I think we all remember the famous picture wherein Javier Milei is actually gifting a chainsaw to Elon Musk. So their entire premise or promise with that chainsaw is that they'll eradicate bureaucracy. So based on that, it is that promise on which Javier Milei is currently ruling his country. And based on the recent studies, he's still quite popular and he enjoys wide support in his country. So the fundamental idea for Javier Milei and deregulation in Argentina is that right from the late 1930s, early 1940s, Argentina has been under a system called the Peronist system under President Peron. So that involved a lot of state control and a lot of regulations. So for more than 80 or 85 years, the country has been undergoing a hell lot of regulation. And because of that, we all remember Argentina running into high amounts of inflation and very low levels of growth. And that is where Javier Milei has come out with a promise to channelize the revolution of deregulation and certain promises that they have made, and they have actually carried out in the last 1.5 years, is that they have reduced the number of ministries from 18 to 8, and they have actually fired 37,000 public employees, and they have actually abolished 100 secretariats and subsecretariats, and they have actually abolished more than 200 lower level bureaucratic departments. So it is, in every sense, it is a truly revolutionary move. How it actually pans out is something for us to study in the near future, but deregulation is quite active. And quite interestingly, the Argentinian Senate has actually empowered the president and his cabinet to carry out wide-scaling reforms without any permission from the Senate. So yeah, so there is a lot going on in the South American nation there.
Thanks so much, Abhishek. It's very interesting. I think like we're diving into this in with fascinating historical and contemporary examples. And I'm just thinking, like, we just discussed very different forms of governments in how they approach the market and how they are organized in forms of governments, Vietnam, Pakistan, Argentina, the US, even India to that matter, right? Like these are across a very diverse set of political frameworks. And I was just thinking, we now that we have this and we have this very, that visceral image of that very chainsaw. What is that chainsaw, right? Like, what is deregulation? What do we mean by it? And also, like, what is the philosophical foundations around it? Now, my understanding of deregulation, put simply, is just that it's a mechanism of sorts that, or rather, the removal or reduction of any laws or government control to allow business to occur better, to allow economic to occur better at a very small level. Even it maybe on a fundamental level, it's even on the notion of decision making, to ease your process of decision making. But maybe there's more philosophical foundations to this, and and investigating that might give us an answer of why, like what you said, Somesh, about the socialist state of Vietnam, the social market economy that they call it, the Donoy reforms that they implemented in the 60s. And just going to Argentina and this free market enterprise that they're doing, or the more democratic forms of government also doing deregulation. What is driving this from a philosophical foundation? And Shiniket, I think you had some interesting points that you had brought up during the workshop.
Yeah, of course, Uday, and I can talk about it, right? So in my perspective, even if you take policies for that matter, of course, Abhishek and Somesh were giving examples of how policies were made, how you're looking at regulation and deregulation and stuff like that. But in my opinion, everything fundamentally breaks down to humans, right? Like what humans think about it, what humans do about it. In my opinion, in a very crude and basic sense, regulations to me are essentially safety nets, right? Let's say when we are just born and somebody threatens to throw us off a 10-story building. Let's say you threaten a 1 month kid to throw them off a 10-story building. The kid won't be scared of it, because at that point a kid doesn't know what an altitude is, what a height is, what happens when we fall, and what it could potentially do to us. But if you do this threatening to a well-grown adult, let's say you ask Udoyan, or I tell Udoyan that I'm going to throw you off a 10-story building, you're probably going to piss your pants, right? So my point is, as humans grow and become more aware of their surroundings, their fears and insecurities sort of compound. And hence they start unconsciously start seeking securities. In other words, what I think as regulations, right? In other words, let's say you have a deposit of over $1 million in your bank. You'd obviously want the bank to adhere to certain regulations. Something like what happens if the bank closes? How do you get your money back? Do you lose your money, right? So I think that's where the entire concept of regulation came in the first place. And of course, we channelized it in such a way that there are institutions that actually regulate us. Something like schools, right? Education is it is a mechanism that undergoes regulation. You also look at banks and other stuff. And in a sense, even government is an institution that regulates. But of course, we are talking about all these examples of deregulation, stripping of bureaucracy, so on and so forth. I think even this comes because of a fundamental sense of distrust that humans have in the society now, right? Like the economy is crashing, the stock market is crashing, people do not have jobs, they can't afford basic necessities like eggs, milk, so on and so forth. So what this has basically driven us to is a point where humans are not able to trust anything at all, right? You can't trust the regulation institutions that you thought were your safety nets in the first place. And hence what made it easy for the right-wing governments or the populist governments is to tap this distrust at a philosophical level, right? Something like, hey, these are the institutions that are supposed to save you, these are your safety nets, but it is this safety net that is actually letting you down, right? It sort of resonated with people because people are very agitated, they need someone or something to be held accountable. And I think that's how this entire concept of deregulation is sort of catching momentum in the contemporary times.
Thanks, Shrinkit. That's a lot to reflect on. And I think you bring, something, very important point. I reflect on Hobbes, and what he said about humans are lives are nasty, brutish, and short. And what we do is that we give some of our freedoms, right? Let's get into the language of that because we hear that word so much these days. But these freedoms that we entrust to a sovereign in the form of a social contract. And from what you're saying, and you throw me some rope here, I'm interested. And Abhishek, I saw that you also had something to say, so we can bring it out more broadly. But what is it about these contracts? Like, what is the contrasting nature of philosophical regulation? Like, is it a cycle? Like, do we move from a lens of let's give our freedoms to this sovereign or to a government so that it can impose rules and regulations that are meant to make us better or meant for our benefit, but we perceive them after some time, or during the course of the history, or someone tells us that no, they're actually not helping you, they're hurting you, they're harming you, and you want your freedoms back. You want to buy as many fancy apples that you can. So what is it about these, this, is there a cyclical nature between regulation and deregulation?
Yeah, I think
Shinikit?
that, yeah, I can probably go about that, right? So thinking about the cyclical nature, I would again like to bring this back to a philosophical concept, and I would like to bring in the concept of language here, right? So in my perspective, regulations and deregulations not necessarily maybe cyclical, but have existed for centuries and even beyond what we can think of. And regulation and deregulation is a concept that is not new, right? It's just because of the language, the word English, you look at the language English, you look at the word deregulation, regulation, we are able to articulate our thoughts into that specific word. But from my opinion, regulation and deregulation have happened in the entire history of humankind, right? Like one thing that I can probably go back, let's say I go back about like 500 years, 600 years, regulation as a concept has always existed. It's just that they did not have the word regulation. You look at British rule in India, or let's say British rule almost entire world for that matter, right? There were always regulations about how you enlist in the military, what crops do you grow, how much tax do you pay for certain crops, so on and so forth, right? So I think regulation as a concept is something that we know has existed for time and forever. But one thing that I also realize is deregulations also existed in the prehistorical times, right? Let's say you look at something like the Roman Empire. Of course, they had a lot of control on how much you were taxed for certain crops, so on and so forth. But at the same time, they realized there are certain times where they need to sort of loosen this concept of regulation. So let's say when the economy is hit, of course, the taxes, take a break, you have a tax break. There are certain crops that you're allowed to grow without paying taxes. So this is in a sense deregulation, right? And one of the most important and interesting examples that I can highlight, since you were talking about cyclical and how it follows a pattern, is industrial revolution, right? Before industries existed, of course, a lot of things were pretty unorganized, chaotic. So and it was mostly like agriculture and farming based stuff, right? So they needed to bring something about industries into this picture. So since you're bringing up industries, it's a new venture. People are tired of the old shit that's been like bothering them. So they want to break free. And that is when industrial regulation probably started on a deregulatory note, right? something like, hey, I'm not going to put in too much structure to make this chaos go away. And ironically, without structure, the chaos actually became streamlined, right? But then the interesting point is you have a lot of industries, and what this deregulatory mechanism gave is for the capitalists to exploit the laborers and workers, right? Like you could work for 18 hours, you could work for 20 hours, there is no proper wage, you're not paid enough, so on and so forth. So what started as a deregulatory movement, in fact, turned out to be a regulatory movement in the latter half, where they said, hey, you need to bring up the concept of minimum wage, right? You need to bring up the concept of, hey, this is the maximum number of hours you can make a person work for a day, for a week, and stuff like that, right? So although not necessarily cyclical, but this world has always evolved, right, from prehistorical times to contemporary times on an alternating pattern of regulation and deregulation. Does it have the equal number of years between this pattern? Maybe, maybe not. But certainly these two are alternating concepts that have always existed. And we sort of just recognize it now in the past, let's say, 50, 100 odd years.
Thanks, Shriniket. Abhishek, you wanted to add something?
Uh, yeah, adding on to the points that Shriniket had mentioned, the philosophical foundations. There is this famous quote which is attributed to Rousseau, the philosopher Rousseau, who goes on to say that a man is born free, but he's everywhere in chains. So this quote, which is ascribed to him somewhere in the medieval period of the world, so at that point of time, this quote was used to fight for the democratic rights and against the monarchy. So once the democratic state took shape, so that gradually started putting many regulations and that started setting up many institutions. Now that very code is actually being used against the very institutions, the very setup that had come up. So just connecting the parts that you and Shriniket were discussing some time ago, like again, it need not be necessarily cyclical, but the world has always swayed between the extremes of regulation and deregulation. And maybe, or unfortunately, my observation is that we have never found that middle path that Lord Buddha famously says that we must always stay on the middle path. The world has been swaying between the extremes of regulation and deregulation, but has never found that middle path. And to again build on one point that Sriniket had just mentioned, to just give an analogy that I had come across while reading a particular book, it says that when we plant a sapling, we definitely need to have a fence so that that sapling is protected, so that that sapling is shaped in a particular way and it grows. Its health is taken care of. But once it starts growing, that very fence actually becomes a problem for it. It actually inhibits its growth, and that is where the fence loses its purpose, and not only loses its purpose, but actually is going against the very purpose that it was put for. So that is where this moderation between regulation and deregulation is something that we must look at.
Thanks so much, both. I'm just reflecting then, because if we break that big, and Abhishek, you bought something, I feel like we should dive into a little further on this middle path, right? And maybe a way to understand this is that we think of regulation and deregulation not as a ideological debate of a versus kind. Like, it's not regulation versus deregulation, but it's more arbitrary controlled versus structured facilitation. When Somesh brought up that point, it is from an empirical lens true that these deregulations have done a pretty fantastic job of raising Vietnam from the post-war, ruins that they were in, to a middle-income country with a very rapid economic growth, and that's been driven very strongly. And when we think of this as an arbitrary control versus structured facilitation debate, we can maybe then think of it in the lens of, well, what does structured facilitation look like? What is good forms of deregulation? What can we cover on these fronts? And when I think of that, I mean, well, who are the players? We have now explored the philosophical foundations. We have dived into contemporary examples. We have given a brief example of what an idea of what deregulation is. So, who are these key stakeholders in deregulation, and what drives their interests? Like, what's driving all of this now? Does anyone want to take that? I feel like this is something we can all chip in. Like, if I think of it, right, there is the concept of a government failure like regulatory capture, which often happens in fracking and oil. where your the regulators are, they're regulating industries become sympathetic to the businesses that they're supposed to be regulating. I mean, Elon Musk, one of his criticisms on this front is very much that, well, you're working in a highly regulated space travel. You're working in a similar space around the area of, you know, semiconductors, electric cars. These are fairly regulated businesses. Is there a risk of regulatory capture where the regulatory agency is more preferential? Somesh, you were saying something. I didn't catch that.
Sure. Yes. To continue your argument, Udayan, uh, I guess as Elon Musk has pointed out in his arguments for what he has brought in or he's trying to bring in through Doge, Department of Government Efficiency, uh, there have been, or I mean, the regulatory capture is pretty much the case all around the world, wherein we see cases of there being an regulatory body and that goes for strong structural norms, structural rules and laws that are to be abided by to enter into that sector, be it petroleum, be it energy, be it transportation, railways to be a very niche example of it. There are not just, I mean, there are various stakeholders, players involved in this. And one portion or one aspect that gets highlighted, not highlighted the much, but is not well thought of is the people working in that sector or the people responsible for the implementation of that regulation, the bureaucracy built around it, and only one narrative from their front is being discussed. I mean, in most cases, be it the case of US, wherein now they are considering of firing X% of the people, or case of Argentina, as explained by Abhishek, wherein Milai has straight away fired 37,000 employees. That discussions uh, naturally gravitate towards the future of, I mean, what would happen to the stakeholders that are the employees or bureaucrats working in that organization. So yeah, I guess that is one key factor. Anyone wants to add more?
Abhishek?
Yeah, one important stakeholder, although they are the largest stakeholders and the most important ones, are the citizens. And that is
Hmm.
where I think one needs to reiterate Sriniket's point of distrust. So
Hmm.
I remember a few years ago, the economic survey that was brought out by the Ministry of Finance, the chief economic advisor in India, it spoke of
Hmm.
trust as the invisible hand that actually enables economic growth, that actually enables stability in the society. So now, if there is one stakeholder that is actually driving deregulation, is the same citizen, but the invisible hand has gone the topsy turvy. It has gone the ulta way, if we can keep it in Hindi terms. It has gone the ulta side. So we have got distrust that is actually distrust among the citizens that is actually pushing deregulation. And secondly,
Hmm.
to again build on the regulatory capture point, there are corporations. So we have seen that some of these big four or the big six or the big 10 companies across the world, they have actually got economic power much beyond the GDP of multiple countries across the globe. So they definitely hold a strong influence on how regulation and deregulation are shaped. And to give a very, very recent example, just today afternoon, Prime Minister Modi had a phone call with Elon Musk. So,
Hmm.
so that shows that there is an engagement that is also happening at a level beyond the political level. So there are corporations, there are citizens, there is the working class that Somesh was speaking of, who are important stakeholders that are driving this. And finally, the politicians, who are also very important, because it is actually quite ironic, Udayan. I think we were talking about this also, that politicians are actually fighting in elections to actually capture power so that they can wield
Hmm.
influence, so that they can regulate. But here we
Hmm.
see that politicians are actually coming to power with the promise to deregulate. So that is quite ironic, but it also shows that the politicians ultimately reflect what the society needs. Or as it is told in Sanskrit, yatha praja tatha raja, like as are the
Uh,
people, so is the king finally. So yeah, these
hmm.
are the important stakeholders who are actually driving deregulation in the present times.
Thanks, both. I mean, this is, I think we dive into the crux of the matter. And maybe here we also take this, because if this is what people are feeling and this is what the mandates on which politicians are being elected, how businesses are growing, we have to also consider that there is a force for good within deregulation if constructed well, right? We think, when we think of this, it is at its core basically wanting to make efficient markets, like facilitate growth and address frustration and distrust of certain institutions which have, at the risk of calling them, have decayed in a certain sense. And I feel like now is the time where we get into the meat of the matter when it comes to specific countries and how we approach these things. So, what do you think, Abhishek? And I think anyone can dive in, but like, what do you think has worked well? Because when we think of India, when we think of the so-called license Raj, it had its well-founded critiques, and I think that the 1991 reforms, in a sense, were quite miraculous. I mean, Martin Wolf, the Financial Times commentator, in his obituary of Manmohan Singh, wrote that he did something pretty phenomenal when you sit and reflect, which is to bring such a massive set of population out of relative poverty into the middle class line, and also the free markets that were opened. I mean, these reforms, and in a sense, a very stringent form of deregulation, was almost miraculous. Shiniket?
Yeah, so then I can talk about it. And I think one interesting point that you brought about was the specific example of India, right? Like, of course, you look at a lot of different countries, you can sort of clearly bifurcate if they want to regulate or deregulate, how the government looks at it. But India historically has been trying to balance both deregulation and regulation, right? Like at the core of India, like you talked about license Raj, India is essentially a socialist country at heart, right? But of course, in the past, let's say a few decades for that matter, we have been trying to like outgrow that image of being socialistic, and we are trying to sort of get some sort of Western values in terms of capitalism, so on and so forth. I mean, again, India is a very mixed bag, right? Like, let's say you look at industries, something like agriculture, labor, environment, it's still pretty socialistic in a view, right? Like they have very strong government controls, there are pretty strong regulations. I mean, how much of it gets efficiently executed is a different ball game altogether, probably not the subject of this podcast. But then again, at least by intentions, we have a lot of regulation in most of these industries. And of course, agriculture is a very large industry, like it's one of our largest employers per se, if you consider that as a sector. So that is being very strongly regulated. But again, at the flip side, if you also look at some industries, like let's say you look at telecom, you look at banking, you look at aviation, it's being strongly deregulated, right? Like you look at telecom, the deregulation has happened to an extent we sort of have a monopoly in telecom and aviation right now, right? Like even if you look at aviation for that matter, there are barely 2 to 3 airlines that run domestic routes in India, and that basically means they can set up exorbitant prices. So regulation deregulation, especially in India, or like since it's trying to balance both of it, there's no clear cut way for us to understand which exact side India is leaning and what exactly is working for India. Like, is it regulation that's working, or is it deregulation that's working? Because if you look at it historically, if I'll probably take the example of financial, or even if I can take the example of aviation for that matter, in the 1978 Carter administration act, they essentially loosened all screws on aviation regulations, right? Since then, they're like airlines were able to decide upon their own routes, they upon their own costs, flight schemes, so on and so forth. And even if you take the financial and banking industry for that matter, that's a very good example, because as soon as the financial institutions were deregulated, right? Like, of course, a single conglomerate, like let's say a very large banking institutions like Citigroup or something like that, can have multiple banking and investment products under one umbrella. Some people say it was this deregulation that sort of caused the entire 2008 financial crisis, right? So that also stems down to India because of indecisiveness, like I mentioned, in two factors. One, we are not able to decide if India falls under the bucket of deregulation or regulation. And the next thing is, let's say we decide which bucket India falls upon, we are not able to evaluate the actual output of that, is my opinion on how India treads along this path of deregulation.
Thanks so much, Aniket. I feel like this is where we sort of bring it to because I don't think we can dwell on the global financial crisis and what caused it. I mean, there are equally compelling arguments that we shouldn't immediately jump to the fact that deregulation was the main criminal in that case. If you were to see, it could be a room for flawed foundations, and there have been good critiques there. But I want to address something that you brought up within your topics and what Abhishek had brought up in a more broader philosophical sense, right? This round of within these contemporary examples, when we think of India, its foundation in a democratic framework, it's, as you said, relatively socialist approach to markets when it comes, when it came to 5-year plans, the who we based it on, the foundations of what drove nearly 50 years of relevant, relatively stagnant economic growth. I feel like we should go towards this final line, and this maybe food for thought on towards closing on what might a balanced approach to this topic look like. What might a balanced approach to state and market regulation look like for the 21st century? Deregulation seems inevitable. It seems that it's there, we have to deal with it. So the question can also be framed in that sense of, like, what kind of regulation do we want? What is the role of the government when it comes to regulation, deregulation on this front? Abhishek, do you want to start on this middle path thing that you touched upon?
Yeah, definitely. Udhayan, like if I can actually build upon the point that Sriniket was making about India, definitely 1991 was a watershed moment in India's financial and economic history, and that's where we are able to record a high amount of growth in the last 3-4 decades, and we have actually brought many people out of poverty. So that shows that deregulation actually helps, and deregulation actually enables good of the society and the economy in the long run. But at the same time, again, to bring it back to moderation on the middle path between regulation and deregulation, one must be conscious. Uh, on a lighter note, just to give a contemporary example, I think we were discussing this in the previous call also, that as Elon Musk actually runs this campaign for government efficiency and President Trump continues to support him, there is this famous political satirical show called The Daily Show that is actually broadcasted in the US, and you can also watch it on YouTube. So there, Elon Musk in one of his press conferences says that my fight is against the unelected bureaucracy. I want to do away with the powers that they have got. But the political satire against it is that Elon Musk is himself an unelected bureaucracy. He himself represents another form of unelected bureaucracy, who is actually running a campaign on unelected bureaucracy that is prevalent. So that shows that there is also some amount of hypocrisy and some amount of hollowness in how this entire argument is being led at present on deregulation. Definitely, it actually catches the pulse of the people that they want less of state across the world, but it also shows that we must also have certain amount of moderation, and that is where your point of healthy amount of regulation actually comes in. So to again go back to a philosophical angle of regulation, a regulation is something which aims to control, which aims to govern. So I think that is where we must actually fundamentally reshape this terminology. And when we say deregulation, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is no governance or no control. Because once there is no governance or no control, it only leads to more and more accidents as we drive in this society or in the economy. So therefore, there must be certain rules, certain regulations, and that
Hmm.
must involve all the stakeholders and
Hmm.
facilitate healthy competition, so that there is innovation, there is infrastructure, there is
Hmm.
inclusivity, and there is also insightful and sustainable growth in the present and in the future. So that is where a healthy balance is something that we must aim to strike.
Thanks so much, Abhishek. I feel like, I feel the tutors of our beautiful policy course in my head. Like, the intentions are good, but how do we evaluate it, right? And how we should also focus on how this, if it were to be a policy recommendation, like, what would be this be evaluated against? I think that a ground for fertile debate in maybe next podcast, but a topic that people can take away is what should be regulated, right? What is the where which in is it specific industries? Is it specific markets? Is it specific players? Shinike talked about this, differing approach when it comes to something like aviation, and a very differing approach when it comes to something like agriculture, or our favorite thing that we consume when we have sickness, which is pharmaceuticals. And I feel like these are very interesting ideas to think, but it's a very solid point of thinking. How do we take a balanced approach, and how do we fundamentally reimagine what deregulation looks like? Somesh, Shiniket, any closing thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can probably go on that.
Yeah.
So of course, you're talking about how we need to like strike a fine balance between how we look at regulation and deregulation. I think one branching point and more of a closing point from my side that I wanted to add is, if you look at specific examples, I'm just probably going to pick India as an example here. So this entire act of deregulation and regulation, at some point within how India operates this, there is some conflict of interest, is what I see, right? So let's say
Okay.
you look at aviation as an industry, you're trying to deregulate it and stuff like that. And of course, you have a lot of, and I'm also going to branch into, let's say, restaurants, something like, you now have cloud kitchens, you have given the access to it. You don't need to have like a proper restaurant per se. All you need to do is, of course, get through the food security stuff and you'll be good to set up a cloud kitchen. So we are essentially deregulating the food space and also the aviation space, right? Now, if I'll have to bring in one thing that the Indian government also does is it also brings in a layer of regulation into it. If I'll have to probably pick a specific example, of course, you look at aviation, it's deregulated, but now recently there is this cafe that's come up with an Indian airports called the Udan Yatri Cafe, if I recollect it right. So it essentially
Okay.
gives you teas, beverages, snacks at about 10 rupees, 20 Indian rupees. That is pretty much affordable for everyone who flies, right? Like a snack for rupee, a snack for 20 rupee is completely affordable by them. But what you also do with this layer of regulation and this layer of interference is that you also ensure that the other restaurants and other cafes and whatever you name it within the airports, which are also in line with the aviation industry, is getting hit here, right? So at one point you deregulate and the other point you regulate. It's absolutely fine to deregulate and regulate together, but you'll have to ensure that it doesn't come to a point where there is conflict of interest even in what you're trying to solve. Of course, when you're looking at something like cabs and all these companies, you have Rapido, Uber, Ola, so on and so forth in India. Of course, government has deregulated enough for us to have these services, but at the same time, if you realize, recently, I think about like 4 5 weeks earlier, the Karnataka state government had put up a ban in bike taxis. So what we're essentially trying to do is we're deregulating and regulating at the same time in the same industry, which is basically a conflict of interest and is leading us to nowhere. So I think much more decisiveness on what you want to do, ensure that you have the output solid, and then find ways to going about it, I think is the best way to strike a balance between both of these concepts.
Thanks so much, Nikita. Yeah, that's a very good point, right? Like that there are cases where the state completely overreaches and it doesn't have the capacity, and also it comes into areas where it shouldn't, which serves what Abhishek was saying and what I was also reflecting on what do we regulate. Somesh?
Yeah. So great points by Srini to start on. Uh, my 2 cents on this: where should actually government regulate or where should it deregulate? What should be frequency? Comes from a small idea from the domain that I've graduated in, that is mechanical engineering. And we
Hmm.
are often taught in our initial years the concept of equilibrium, dynamic equilibrium, which also seeps in into the economic thought. It also has a parallel in the biological, or I mean, let's say the biological domain known as the homeostasis, right? So my personal opinion on the place wherein government should either come in or go out is should be based on a dynamic equilibrium. It should be it should be a homeostatic process. If we are to take the case of, as discussed by Srini, the case of Rapidos and Olas or bike taxis, the initial setup wherein there was no regulation was, I mean, a wild west wherein any one of us could that would be able to fulfill basic requirements, would get a bike and go on, start their own business. But then, as government got their feedbacks from the auto unions or various types of unions for which they have regulations and stringent regulations in place, there was a strong pushback from them, as well as many cases of complaints from citizens, lack of security measures, lack of uniform rate structure, the extraction of wealth from the people that are riding those bikes, etc. And then there comes a time wherein the government has to step in and push the barrier towards the regulation or the regulatory part. Now, coming from a meta concept or a small philosophical observation here is that governments or any regulating body in any space, or at least let's say the
Hmm.
space of nation states, has always been of an overcorrecting nature. If you are to take the cases of presidents post Ronald Reagan, each president has been overcorrecting what previous president has done. So if one president decides to go extreme on the path of extreme
Thanks,
regulation, the
thanks,
other,
Somesh. But
yeah.
I
So,
feel like if we dive into presidential decision making, that might expand it a little further because we
yeah.
dive into what they do. But I think that we should keep that in the back of our head. I think that's a very solid point. So I'm now, Abhishek, I think you had something to add, but what is it that you were thinking of?
Uh, what I was thinking on is that this entire thing as to the question that you're actually leading, and we had a discussion on for last 5 minutes. What is it that we
Hmm.
must regulate? What is it that, sorry, the state must regulate, the state must not regulate or deregulate? There is no simple answer to it. And because the thing is that it is based on the needs of the society and the economy at that point of time. And there cannot be one concrete or final solution. For example, in the late 1970s, it was felt in the US that education needs to be regulated. So there was a Department of Education. But now in 2025, there is a move against it, and they're closing down Department of Education. So it always moves between these two extremes, and it is difficult to lead to come to the final conclusion as to what must be regulated, what must not be regulated. And one thing that I can suggest to our listeners is that there is this book called Nitopadesha by Nitin Pai, wherein there is one part on subtle scales of judgment. It is the part 3 of the Nitopadesha book, which shows that it is not very easy to judge or to arrive at a decision. And this same subtle scale of judgment is something that also applies to this entire debate on regulation and deregulation. There is no simple answer, definitely, but I do think that we as a group have actually started a healthy discussion in this particular field, and hope so we'll be able to continue in the coming future.
Thanks so much, Abhishek. I feel like that is the right time to reflect and think think of next steps is that let's move away from these extremities of versus to a more approach on spectrum and what it looks like as opposed to adopting extreme stances. And I feel like that is something that we can take that we can take some time to reflect on. In my personal life, I would like to deregulate myself from my depleting bank balance. But that's not going to happen.
That's a challenge that all of us have.
Yeah, all of us face it. There is no solution to that.
Yeah, yeah, the struggles are real. So much for all the great philosophical foundations. Well, my friends, I hope you regulate yourselves better on the weekend. Uh, have a good time and bye bye from my end, at least.
Thank you all.
Thank you and good night. Let's continue this discussion sometime in the future.
Sure, Abhishek. And just a funny thing or a observational thing to point out before we say bye is we literally are talking from four corners of country. So yeah, let's come together from all four corners and take this discussion more ahead.
And
Thanks,
sorry
Somesh.
to add
That's
on to
the
what
plan.
Somesh has told, sorry to add on what Somesh has told. It is said in the Vedas that let knowledge flow from all four directions and may the best emerge. So maybe, as Somesh has just pointed out, we have come from all four directions and hopefully the best emerges. I think with that hope, let's close it.
That's-
Hello then, guys. Good night.
Good
Thank
night, guys.
Good night, guys.
Bye bye.